We have a very, very interesting speaker who's come all the way down from up north to share his remarkable research. He's an archaeologist, he's a teacher at the University of Bradford. He studied at the University of Reading. He's been involved in the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project and the Durrington Shafts discovery. And the main reason he's here today is to share his remarkable research on Doggerland, the lost land that once existed between Britain and Europe. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Vince Gaffney.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I suppose I should warn you straight away that no stones were harmed during the making of this research. In fact, the only stone you will see is actually about 2 inches high. So I'm giving you the chance to walk out now. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is some work which has essentially been going on for about 20 years now. It's very rare in the modern world that you can truly and utterly explore unknown lands. Name rivers, countryside, everything else. But the work in Doggerland has to some extent allowed, I and my colleagues have been fortunate enough to do that. Now, lost worlds and water worlds, they are, I think, relatively well known to you perhaps. But we don't need to talk about Atlantis, we don't need to talk about Mu, we don't need to talk about Lemuria. Although Helena Blavatsky's description of Lemurians sound much like the archaeologists I meet day to day. Hermaphrodite apes, some with 4 eyes in the back of the head and up to 3.7 meters tall. Well, I don't make the height grade for that, I suppose. But the countryside that I'm going to talk to you about today is more foreign than almost anything that you're ever likely to come across. It's more foreign than the Romans, it's more foreign than the Iron Age peoples of Northwest Europe, it's more foreign than Bronze Age or Neolithic or anything. This is a period when the world actually changed, that the world you know today did not as such exist. During this period, in the immediate post-glacial, about 18,000 through to about 5,000 BC. Often called parts of it late Pleistocene, late Paleolithic, early Holocene, Mesolithic. The shape of the world changed. At the start of the period, water levels were about 120 meters lower than today. It was only about 5,000 BC that the shape of the world that you knew came about. During that period, the nature of the landscape that you've been looking at changed. This countryside you see today is largely the result of agriculture. You know, all those lovely valleys with, the little channelized river running through the center. This is caused by sedimentation from farming over the last 6,000 years or so. The actual, the climate, of course, naturally changed as global warming occurred. And this is the last period global warming took place that was as extreme as we are about to experience. We went from, at the very earliest period, from essentially tundra, or at least semi-tundra, by the end progressing through various grasslands, through to the mixed temperate woodlands that we're perhaps more familiar with today. Even the economy changed during this period. At the outset, we were hunter-gatherers, the most long-standing, successful economy of all time, lasted millions of years. By the end of the period is the onset of agriculture. So everything that you think you know about this period changed over the time, and this is significant. At the end of the last glaciation, there were very large areas of land which were exposed to the air, which are not covered by sea. There were vast areas between Alaska and Siberia, Kamchatka, the area of the Bering Straits. These areas are often given names, Beringia. Down in Southeast Asia, in the Sunda Straits, an area about the size of India disappeared. That became known as Sundaland. And despite my accent, that's the wrong town in my opinion, but never mind, right? But the point area we're going to look at is Doggerland, up in northwest Europe, between Britain and the continent, a time when the British Isles were little more than a range of hills, on the insignificant hills, and I'll say that, on the edge of Europe. But during this period, about 20% of the surface of Western and Central Europe disappeared beneath the sea. So it was, this really was different. Now, perhaps we're ready to appreciate coastal change. Well, if you're of a certain age and you did O-levels, histories in the bloody 1832 Reform Act, you'll know about Dunwich, the medieval town which disappeared into the sea and still had 2 MPs being returned as a rotten borough. Well, that's one scale of change. And in fact, today, there have been surveys off the East Anglian coast, and Dunwich is now being mapped. Even during the the mid-Victorian period, people, though, had an idea about the fact that this was once an area that was dry land. This is the wonderful Robert Godwin Austen, who produced in the 1850s a basic map of what he felt would be a large plain between Britain and the European coast. Even H.G. Wells wrote about it in the late 1890s. So I can't claim to be discovering things to a certain sense. That he wrote a story of the Stone Age when you could walk across the North Sea from the Thames to meet his father Rhine. It's a terrible story, by the way. Don't go and read it. I'll save you that at least. But, there was a certain knowledge there. And that knowledge, I'm glad to say, went even further into the 20th century because H.G. Wells' original text seems to be mirrored very closely by this. I mean, sex tourism, organic carrots and Toblerones, 9 surprising moments from Boris Johnson's Brexit speech. Nothing stranger than the fact he mentioned Doggerland in order to support his position on Brexit. And there is sometimes a debate about Brexit and archaeology and stuff like that. Well, I'd just like to say, in Fawlty Towers terms, he started it first, right? But there were key moments in this process. Clement Reid, a geologist in the early 20th century, wrote a wonderful book called Submerged Forests. He worked out on the basic geological basis that must have been a plain in the North Sea. He was looking at fossil forests on the edge of the country. He couldn't do much with it, because he said, he couldn't date it, and he had hopes that sometime we'd find a scarab or something in the mud huts of our ancestors to help date these things. And he said, archaeologists inclined to think these things are geological, and the geologist says that they're too modern to be worth his attention, and both pass on. And that's true, because when I read that book, it hadn't been taken out the university library since before I was born, and I'm not 21, right? Now, this continued. The doyen of the Mesolithic period, Graham Clark, said, this is awful. Essentially, we've lost all the principal areas of settlement in northwestern Europe, not the rubbishy little hills on the side. And effectively, in 1936, the only real evidence was this thing called the Kalinda harpoon, which had been trawled up out of a bit of peat bog by the trawler Kalinda. And you can see why it was difficult to understand this period on land, certainly in the east, because that's the depth you had to go down to find the early Holocene, late Pleistocene periods in East Anglia. And that's Clark at the bottom of Peacock Farm. So this is a problem in how to understand these periods. And in fact, whilst we began to understand more and more about the Mesolithic during the 20th century, we've got there Starcar, Howick, Mount Sandal, our only real underwater settlement of this period, which is Boulder Cliff. Bryony Coles, an archaeologist from Exeter in 68, pulled together all the evidence and produced what she called a speculative survey. And she produced these maps you can see there. But she said, we actually have no more evidence than Clark had in the 30s. So now going on for 90 odd years ago. But that spurred an awful lot of work. During this period, archaeological prospection in this area was essentially what came up in trawlers and ended up on eBay, and stuff that you could find on the edge of coasts, but not in the deep areas. The only thing that happened was archaeologists looked over the side of the boat, said, we can't see much there, and they called it a land bridge, somewhere you passed from A to B in order to become British. That's essentially what they're thinking. So, we really knew little or nothing at this period. Now, I've been lucky enough for the last 15 years to be part of a team working initially at Birmingham, now at Bradford, which has been working gradually, picking away at this problem. A whole series of projects have taken place, starting with the North Sea Paleolandscapes project, funded by the Aggregates Levy, through the West Coast, the eastern sector of the North Sea, funded by the Americans, God bless them, and now currently with a series of projects called Taken at the Flood, Life on the Edge, and Unpathed Waters. We've produced a lot of publications. They're all free to download. You can get them when you want. The big change was when about 15 years or so ago, actually more than that, we realized that so many other people were working in the North Sea, particularly the oil and gas groups, and they were doing the mapping which we could never hope to do. So we wandered up to a oil and gas exploration company and said, hey, why don't you give us all this data that you've been collecting for billions of dollars, and we'll look for a land you've never heard of. And we weren't thrown out, which was strange. And they said, oh, right, and I brought a geologist for safety. And they said, we know him, we don't know you, but he's okay. He said, we don't trust you very much. We're not going to give you very much data. We're going to give you 6,000 square kilometers of oil and gas 3D data to look at, which of course immediately made it the biggest archaeological survey in the world. One go, yes. But this stuff was interesting. It's this seismic data in 3D. It's multiple streamers collecting data along lines which they put together into a cube. And effectively, that's a data cube you can slice and dice. And in some senses, archaeologically excavated. It's not very, very fine resolution. These things were about 25 meters intervals. But with that, you can effectively scrape away the stratigraphy at a large scale, landscape scale, and produce a chronostratigraphy of the features you can see inside that. And in fact, within almost weeks of the project starting, we came across this. And I think you can see it even at the point, the snaking outline of a river right in the centre of the North Sea, which we presumed at that point was about 10,000 BC. We named it, oh God, this is power. We named it after Professor Fred Shotton, great geologist from Birmingham, mapped the beaches before D-Day for landings, very eminent. And we thought, yes, we knew we can do this. We then started stripping this stuff apart. You can see here a Holocene river in blue with a Cerise stream going under it. The green is a depression, probably a swamp, a marsh or a lake. Underneath that in gold, that is a tunnel valley. And it's not a tunnel valley of the sort you expect in the Highlands. It's where the glacial outflows are just carving a route through the soft sediments of the North Sea. So we knew we could do something with this data. Gradually, by little, we eventually persuaded the companies to give us more data because they could see that we weren't entire charlatans. Didn't say not charlatans, just not entire. And eventually, after 2 phases of research, we had about 45,000 square kilometres of knitted geological surveys, actually provided by a group called Petroleum Geoservices, which allowed us to work at a massive scale. We kept on going. We got hundreds of rivers. We got dozens of lakes, marshes extending over 500 square kilometres, absolutely enormous amounts, which we just gradually, little by little, put together and started to build up the map of an entire prehistoric country. But it had no dates. It had no real dates. We could not necessarily prove what we were looking at was of the date we thought it was. And in fact, there was a very big debate as to whether we were not making it up, but entirely misreading the data that we were putting out. That's what happens when you let archaeologists play with their data. But we were lucky. The government funded what was called the Humber Regional Environment Characterization Project. So we'll call it the Humber Rec. And that gave us a great chance to go out with the geologists and drop massive cores into the features that we were seeing and get a variety of data out. We got, for instance, paleo-environmental information. You can see the cores that we pulled up being studied there. You can see a hazelnut located in one of the cores, still preserved. And as every one of you will know who knows anything about the Mesolithic, the only thing that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers have social relationships is with hazelnuts. So we're on the right track there, guys. And equally importantly, they produced a series of dates for individual features. In the top left-hand corner, there's a great big river with an estuary on what's called the Silver Pit, is one of the key areas which we got dates from. But interestingly, that date, which is coloured in yellow, suggested that we might have not just an early Holocene Stonehenge landscape, we might have a Neolithic one as well. Now, if that was the case, that was our initial interpretation, the mapping. You could probably swim over to Britain at that period. Actually, it's probably wrong, but it doesn't matter at this point. But we shouldn't have been surprised about the fact that there was a later landscape. Seahenge, which you may know, this wonderful wooden henge structure with a big tree upended in the middle of it, dated by dendrochronology to 2049 to 50 BC, is, of course, right below high water. But that's got 2,000 years of coastal retreat in advance of it, during the Neolithic, never mind the Mesolithic. So there had to be something out there. And not just that, we were finding things like at the bottom there, the Mickelsburg axe, early Neolithic, dropped into one specific area of the North Sea, which we'll come back to. So there's artifactual evidence in there as well. One other thing drove us, and this was experimentation we did with sedimentary DNA, taking DNA extracted directly from archaeological sediments. We did this at Boulder Cliff in the Solent, as I said, the only archaeological submarine site of this date that we have. And shockingly, we got what appears to be wheat, probably einkorn, in this. Now, we're not saying there was farming at this time, but there may well have been trade in advance of pioneer farmers. Now, that's still a controversial find, but it's there. It's not been falsified, and more work is going on at the moment. But again, it said we have to go back and do something more in these areas. So, in 2015, the European Research Council, God bless them again, funded a large project to do more topographic mapping, to reconstruct the environment, and to look for cultural signals out at sea. We started off with this, the hashed areas, the original study area of the southern North Sea and off the west coast of Wales and in Liverpool Bay. We had a dotted area to the north, which we thought was within the terrestrial areas prior to inundation. This has probably changed because of work done by the Brit Ice project, looking at glacial margins, and it now seems very likely that the late Pleistocene, early Holocene coastline is essentially the area you see there, with either at the early periods ice and a glacial lake or marine inundation creeping through. So the areas we were looking at were smaller than we'd anticipated. We were going to do more seismic mapping, environmental analysis, DNA would be obviously in there, and we also decided to start computer simulation of the areas as a whole, because you can only say so much from a couple of 4-inch marine cores. This went well. We kept on mapping. The big red splodge you can see up there is the Paleoelbe going out to sea, a massive, really important feature there. We've done lots of detailed analysis of the data, huge wetlands. We've gotten detail now. We can reconstruct the topography, the pre-inundation topography to some extent now as well. What really came across, of course, though, was this is a dynamic landscape. Between 13,000 years before present through to the final coastline emergence, you had huge amounts of retreat. In the north, the so-called Dogger Hills, which would have been very low rises. Most of the topography or the bathymetry you see today is all the crud which is being dumped by the big rivers of northwestern Europe. But that island would have emerged from the land. It would have eventually been inundated from the north with Great Lakes and then marine inlets appearing all the way around it. In the south, there was a major marine embayment coming up from the channel, rising up, which solved our problems because we had paleo channels we were mapping in red out there, which just finished. We couldn't understand why these early Holocene rivers never went further. Of course, that's the coastline, which we'd not mapped until this point. We eventually got a much more comprehensive map of the areas that we're looking all the way across to Denmark. Although it's still a lot to be done, I'll hasten to say that. And, essentially we had a 4-stage model of retreat. You've got Doggerland, the one we imagine, walk from the Humber to Denmark, 10,000 cal BP. But within a relatively short amount of time, most of that landscape actually disappears. You have an archipelago of a rump of Doggerland with Dogger Islands and smaller islands into the North Sea. They retreat, the Dogger Island becomes smaller, and eventually it's a littoral. And that's probably our Neolithic landscape out on the east coast of Britain. So what do we do next? We had a plan. Plan A, I will call it. We had these rivers, we're going to drop cores into them, down the rivers, because rivers which are being inundated are time machines. The further down you go, the further back in time you get the information. So we're going to get two rivers, one coming out from the Wash, one coming from the Dogger Island, misleadingly just called 1 and 2 on this map. And we were going to, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take this information, turn it into useful archaeological data and clothe this landscape. Then we had Plan B, because it took a while to get the money, and we forgot why we had the dotted line in one of these valleys. And then we remembered, it's because it's got modern sandbanks so big, we couldn't call through it. So Plan B came along. Then Plan B and B plus came along because Brexit turned up. Now, that shouldn't have stopped us, but actually we got license issues about it. People weren't sure what the impact was going to be, and the result of that was we actually had to take fewer cores. We'd wanted over 100 to begin with, so we couldn't do all the areas we wanted, and we had to have Plan C, which was to change part of this down a small river channel, which we knew the whole length of, which we called the Southern River, and that was where we went. Eventually, we got 78 cores from 60 locations. Now, that's a huge lessening of data and cost effectiveness as a result of bureaucracy at that point. I always say that taking a core is virtually costs very little. Moving a ship 1 inch from the shore costs you £60,000. So if you're not getting as many cores, the unit cost is going up. The sediments we got, wonderful though. Lacustrine, organics, all the things that geologists and archaeologists like. Peat deposits up to several meters thick. We kept people employed looking at this stuff. Paleomagnetics on the left, pollen on the right hand side there. Optically stimulated luminescence to date the cores, where particularly for those areas we don't have organics and therefore can't get C14 dates. And of course DNA. The full kit for this has to be extracted under red light because the optically stimulated luminescence has to be done after this extraction. So we got information. Now we'll go back to the Southern Valley because that's the bit we knew best of all. That's what it looks like. It's a long valley going to an estuary. It bifurcates at its head. It's lovely. It's not straightforward to core down a river valley. If you've got sandbanks on top, you can't necessarily get through. You might have erosion. So it's patchworks of visibility, which we drop the cores into. But the result was we had a pretty fair string of cores which showed the movement from inundation from landscape to inundation, going from top to bottom. Some things were surprising. At the bottom, we got this. This we thought, is it a lake sediment? It's rotten chalk. Now, it looks like there are a series of low cliffs all the way around here. We don't know whether these had flint, but if they did, there would clearly be a resource for hunter-gatherers. We've got a good idea of the way this thing inundated, a series of cores going up. We've got two infill complexes because inundation is not linear. It stops, it starts, and that's what you're seeing there. And at the top, you've got a saddle which actually has a freshwater spring and an inner basin above that to the north. So we're starting to get landscapes which look real. And this is what we're looking at about 6,200. A lump out the side of England. You've got big marshes and infilled valleys coming out from the Wash into what's called the inner silver pit. You've got things which might be resources like these chalk cliffs, which we could map in various spots, fresh water, as we've said, with the springs in the landscape. All of this worked. But then, what else? Now, we live in a very safe country. Or was it? You may not realise, but the North Sea is a very unstable place. The Dogger Bank earthquake of 31 is pretty much the largest earthquake recorded in Britain, 6.1 on the Richter scale, and it's caused by huge salt deposits moving beneath the landscape at a great depth. And you can see on the Northern Echo, all Britain shaken by an earthquake. That tells you, and if you're on the right-hand side, it says what the talks with the Germans mean. Well, it was pushed off to the side. I bet we wish we'd kept talking at that point a bit later, But at this point, I'm going to talk about ELF 1A. It's the first core that we took. It's right at the head of the Southern River. We didn't look at it for a while once we got it back, but when we did, we got that. And you say, what's that? Well, that's a core. It has lots of little lines, you can see it, clay sort of laminations, which were annual rings essentially. But in the middle of it, it's got that, which is, you can see the laminations annually being laid down. Above that funny stuff on the left-hand side, and then it continues again. Now, that in the centre we technically call a heap of crap. It's just mashed up shell and stones and everything like that, 40 centimetres deep, and it took us a while to realise what we were looking at. It's a tsunami deposit. Now, about 6200 BC, an area the size of Scotland shifted just off Norway. It caused a tsunami which hit all over the north of England, Scotland. Norway obviously got it, all the way to Iceland and beyond, but we've never generally found it in the south of the North Sea. But people always postulated anything that big, it's the end of Doggerland. Curtains, guys, so the end of everything. This looked different to us. We could see it even in the DNA. Here we've got going up from below, you've got a meadow area there. Then suddenly there's a whole pile of woodland appears in the tsunami deposit, and then it goes back to meadowlands and other types of ecology. And what you're seeing there is the drawback of this tsunami pulling the woodland back into the basin where 1A, the core 1A, is extracted. With not just that, the geochemistry, looking at particularly the shell and the sediment size, tells us that we can see that 3 big waves hit this landscape. You can see them where the shells are being pushed out from the sea in onto the land, and then you've got terrestrial geochemistry as they're pulled out again. 3 big waves. So this must be bad. And yes, and not least for the reason, because in the contemporary landscape, this is 40 kilometres inland. So what the heck are you dealing with? Well, luckily, of course, we have the topography. And we know this is at the head of a channel and near some Devonian ice moraines. And the water from the tsunami is being channeled up, and it's smashing its way right into the heart of this bit of Doggerland that's surviving at 6,200. And this is what's happening. The green bit is where we think you'd get this flooding. ELF 1A is in the centre. It's in a basin. That's why it's been preserved. But the dark green areas are essentially not touched. So if you were on the coast that day in 6,200 circa, it was a bad day for you, trust me. But you could have probably watched it from a highland, and in any case, the evidence from the court says it just went straight back to, it eventually went back to the same sort of landscape it is. It wasn't destroyed by, the landscape wasn't destroyed by the Storega. Or how often do you see all landscapes hit by a tsunami being lost forever? They always draw back, and it's the same here. People undoubtedly suffered that day, but it wasn't the end of Doggerland. It was eventually just lost to the sea, the inevitability of climate change. But, you clever people, you'll have spotted the elephant in the room, because we have all this evidence for topography. We have all the evidence for the environment. We're starting to put it together. but we have no people. And this is the problem, and this is pretty much a global problem. Below about 12 meters deep and beyond 20 kilometers at sea, there are almost no archaeological finds. It's generally the areas in which you would have to work are so extreme you wouldn't want to be there. And trust me, the North Sea is not an easy place to dive in, for instance. And the chances of discovery are very, very little. And of course, by the time when we were doing this, for the early Holocene, it was, just as Karl Ark said in 1936, it would be great to take comfort from the fact that such cultures might not have existed, were it not eminently true that not only did they exist, but they would have flourished under conditions better than on the lands around them. These are the best real estate for hunter-gatherers. Water, birds, fish, fresh water, reeds, you name it. This is the place where you want to live. But we have almost no evidence. And the truth is, you can see this very easily. Virtually all of our evidence is just in this band around the edge of the coastlines themselves. Everything else has been chance finds. They've been brought up by fishing, aggregate extraction. We may go back and find things, but pretty much everything is a chance find as such. We know almost nothing. Even after all the work we've done, it was terra incognita. It was unknown. It's only on the bottom left-hand side, those are the tracks, GPS tracks of smaller fishing boats. And you can see they're attracted to some areas, not to others. Some areas are deliberately avoided because of the geology. We've changed the nature of fishing in recently. Beam trawlers are pretty much illegal across the North Sea, even though the Dutch like their flatfish, and that's what they're there for. But everything we know is just a question of chance. So what do we do? Well, we could do something like this. Back in the 30s, when they weren't talking to the Germans, the suggestion was that we could have a massive dike across the Northern Sea, turn it into dry land, make it getting to Europe be so much easier. I don't know what Boris Johnson said. He's probably around by then. Great stuff. I mean, whilst the military planners probably thought good tank country, I bet, So, but, obviously a stupid idea, but stupid ideas still keep coming back. So we've got the North European Enclosure Dam, which has been suggested to stop inundation from climate change, like medieval medicine, treat the symptoms, eh? But it's essentially the same thing. Giant dams and closing the North Sea could protect millions from rising waters. Same sort of thing. So what could we do? Well, in the original programme for Europe's Lost Frontiers, I hasten to say, as an ERC project, the most ironic title that you could get in 2015, we said that we could carry out computer modelling, and we started to do this. We had one chap called Michael Butler who worked on looking at the impact of humans on let's see this, get this one to work. Come on, you can do it? No, probably isn't going to let me do this. Never mind. So you could look at the impact of humans on trees, look at the pollen fallout, so we could get signals for human activity. But you know what? This is a huge job, and we're not there by a long way. The computational resources are huge to do this over any area. The data inputs are equally complex as well, though we are moving. What we came to the conclusion was that there was a Goldilocks zone of archaeology, much as in astronomy, for finding habitable planets out there. We have a zone, a very small area that we are likely to find human habitation. The first is knowing where people were. And that's complex with the Mesolithic, because where people were is they're relatively mobile. They're relatively small amounts of traces of their activities. We need to know where the archaeology might survive. Now, there's 2 points about that. It took us quite a long time, but we eventually began to realise that all the cores we were doing down river channels, and people don't live inside rivers. That's clever, right? But also, the other point is, of course, this is a massively dynamic landscape. Some areas, as inundation proceeds, will be stripped. I mean, they'll be eroded away. So, those areas aren't going to survive. In those areas, the archaeology won't survive. But not just that. I've already said to you, there's a huge amount of sediments being dumped on these areas. Some of these places have just so much modern sediment on, we can't core through them. So we've got to get a Goldilocks zone where the people were, where the archaeology survived, and where the sediments are accessible. And that's a massive, massive job to work that out. Now, we do have some hints about this. There's a place called the Brown Bank. It's on the median line, or just before, on the west of the median line of between us and the Dutch. And for decades and decades, trawlers have been pulling up archaeology from this area. Now, generally they didn't like looking at trawling this area. It's called the Stickles, because the geology is not good for putting nets over the area. But nonetheless, over time, we got worked bone from it, human remains, stone artifacts. There's a perforated hammer there. But we haven't been able to say where this stuff is coming from. This was a big puzzle for us. So we decided with colleagues from Ghent and from Vlies, the Flemish Marine Institute, from the Dutch groups, and we decided to go back with high-resolution survey equipment, parametric echo sounders, down to, tens of centimetres, giving us real hold on it, using what's called grabs and the Gilson dredges to recover sediments. AUVs we'll be going back with. And even better, these people had access to military and national survey ships. Belgica 1, we've used, it's a military ship. The surveys were so successful, they contributed to the Belgians laying the keel for Belgica 2, and there's a research vessel, Pelagia. I have to say that getting a ship for British archaeology in Britain is almost impossible. You have to use commercial vessels, and they cost horrendous amounts. We actually have to go to Europe to get the support we need to do this work. We then laid a series of very tight grids over the banks and the areas where some of this stuff appeared to be coming from. And lo and behold, what we've found is a peat bed that's in dark green on the right-hand side, which is coming out of the banks, of the sand banks, which is an eroding surface, and which we thought might be where some of this material is coming from. And in fact, we've now got data to suggest there's moderately extensive surfaces underneath the banks, and we've got dates from it, which the top at any rate, which gives us a likely area of stuff to look at. And we've gone back and dredged the area. And what we got here was peat, unsurprisingly, large bits of wood. There's a forest, preserved forest in this area. Lots of charcoal, interesting in its own right. Things burn for many reasons, but you never know. And squirrel bones, but there you go. Not grey, of course. But that suggested we were on the way to do something. We could do something with this technique. Now, is this going to work? Right, okay. One of the areas of dynamic modelling has been done by one of my colleagues, Phil Murgatroyd, for a project, Unpathed Waters, which is intending to make the National Maritime Collection available to everyone to search. And we're dealing with the paleolandscapes, and we're going to produce a usable model for this. And this is an hour-by-hour inundation plot of the western area of the southern North Sea. So you're seeing, using multiple sea level curves, you're seeing it be inundated before your eyes. You're seeing it shudder because that's the tides, actually, hour by hour, as the model progresses all the way through to about 5000 BC, when the current land coastlines stabilise. Now, that's useful because even though it's not directly produced for this work, it gives us clues as to where coastlines are stable for long periods, because coastlines are generally areas where hunter-gatherers are likely to collect, and some areas most specifically. Estuaries, headlands, where you might be wanting to look for fish, and where there are different resources available. So we can actually use this inundation model to look at areas. Now, here we've got, this is on what's called the Silver Pit, just south of the Dogger Bank, the Hornsea area, and you've got a series of areas which have got big rivers coming into sheltered areas which could be attractive to human settlement. But this has got massive deposits on top of them. We can't call through it. So look at, this might be nice, but we can't work in these areas. The Brown Bank, an area where we've started to work and we think has opportunities, seems to exist on the edge of lakes and then coastal margins. So it has a rationale, and we're starting to find material, but not evidence for people as yet. But we don't know if the exact area we've looked at is where we need to look at the moment. That's work in progress. The other one is the Southern River. The Southern River exists on the area on the right-hand side of a large lake, which is then inundated from the south as this great big embayment forms. But the estuary itself seems to retain some coherence for a very long time. So we thought, why don't we go back there? It's this area we've got most information from. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could go out to this area, take a dredge it, survey it in detail, and come back heroes of archaeology? Wouldn't that be nice? And so we went out, a team went out, we did some survey on the Brown Bank, we headed over to the Southern River. The problems of working in the North Sea are legion. The weather was atrocious. We had hours to do work, so did some limited survey, and we did a dredge across the estuary from bank to bank. That was all we could do. There was no time to do anything else. This is a short while ago, and we said that's it. That's all we could do. What a pity! And of course, when we opened up this dredge deposits, we found the first struck flint that had ever been directly prospected from the southern North Sea. Now, we said we should find evidence here. It was found on the northeastern edge of the estuary. It's part of a hammerstone for you creating other tools, and it's shattered at some point when it's being used and it's just been dropped. The exact date of it, we don't know, but it shows that we can prospect in these areas. It takes a lot of work, it's not cheap, but if we're going to create the histories we want, to know about what should be the heart of human settlement in northwestern Europe, these are areas we've got to work. Now, you might say, that's great. Get out there, Gaffney, and your mates. Just get on doing it. But of course, there are all problems, but also potentials as well. What you may have noticed is the development of wind power. Large wind farms are spreading across the North Sea. Our net zero goals demand that they are. And trust me, archaeology is not out to stop that. We will need this. The development of wind farms is being pushed because of events in Eastern Europe, Ukraine. There's just a quote, Denmark to harvest full potential of North Sea to ensure independence from Russian fossil fuels. There's Boris again. I have no other lecture which hasn't been 3 times. Trust me. Wind farms could power over home by 2030, and of course, that's going to require large development over very large areas of the coastal shelf, and the coastal shelf, which is most readily developable, is the archaeological landscape. So those blue areas are the areas which are licensing in the 4th round of the wind farm development. Now, you could say, oh, God, that's awful. Or you could say, we've got to work with people because we need these wind farms. We have to hit net zero. We've got to work with these people in order to get out there. In the same way we worked with the oil and gas groups, now we'll work with the wind farm developers. It's not taking pieces of silver or whatever. It's how we could do. We can feed into ethical development of the area, and that must be good for everyone, surely. So this is a critical moment and a global opportunity, because what's happening in the North Sea, and we are in advance of many areas in the world, is going to happen on every coastal shelf. And on all these coastal shelves are habitable land, or were habitable landscapes after the last glacial. So this is a critical point. And remember, once we get these things built, we are not going to be, large areas will not be accessible, not because of the pylons, but because of all the cabling. And no captain drops a core on top of a cable and, gets mistaken for a Russian trawler and then starts World War III. I mean, you don't want that. So, but large areas of these habitable landscapes will not be accessible in 20 years' time. So now is the time we have to start working it. Now, the people I work with are reacting to this. We've got 2 projects working on the late Pleistocene settlement evidence and the early Holocene, taken at life on the edge and taken at the flood. And we've got this Unpathed Waters project, which is pulling all this data to make it publicly accessible. Last week? Was it last week? Well, it was this week, depending on how you look at it. We've held our first workshop on talking to the developers, the national curators, about how we can actually undertake this work, to work out methodologies which can be applied in the future. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to have instant results, but it is absolutely critical if we are able to understand these archaeological landscapes, which until recently we knew less about than the surface of the moon. So this is work which is definitively in progress. It's certainly not done by one person. Huge numbers of people are involved in this across the North Sea, and there are others, geologists and many others, who are doing wonderful work as well. The developers are in with us, and that's pretty much where we are. Thank you very much.